Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
I'm Nathan Kiker. Welcome to our podcast, Clearer Than Truth. I'm glad to be joined by my co-host, George Bogdan.
The wisdom of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson inspires our episodes. We emphasize clarity while examining the intricate global issues of today for a diverse audience.
In a world where time is limited, we distill complex ideas, making them not just comprehensible, but in Acheson's words, clearer than truth.
Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Matthew Klein. Matthew is an analyst for the Cook Political Report. There, he provides nonpartisan coverage of U.S. and gubernatorial elections. We also had a chance to speak with Matthew about the presidential election. Before we dive into our interview, let's take a look at the news of the day. President Trump and Vice President Harris continue to stump across the country in the final week of the presidential campaign. Earlier this week, Trump held a raucous rally at Madison Square Garden in New York. In the Middle East, violence continues between Israel and Gaza, and a UN report highlights that global action plans for climate change are not adequate. The UN urged nations to adopt stronger measures to tackle climate change. Matthew Klein, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. We are, of course, 1 week out from the election. Let's start from the top. You work for Cook Political Report, sort of the best forecasters in the country. What's going to happen on Tuesday? Let's start broadly. Who's our president-elect in 8 days?
The million dollar question. That's right. Look, I mean, I don't think that we know. I think we won't surprise anybody it won't surprise anyone to learn that we believe this race is extremely close. That's based on not just what we're seeing publicly, but also a lot of data that we're seeing privately, some internal polling and data sets that we get from figures in both parties behind the scenes. We get a lot of information all the time, and that's plays a big role in helping us inform our decisions about where we move our ratings. I think the big question here is it's going to come down to, will Donald Trump actually make inroads with non-white voters? I feel like this is the giant question mark of this campaign. We've seen that all cycle, that in polling, there is indication that he's making not just small, but in some cases significant inroads with groups like African Americans and Latinos in particular. That was particularly pronounced when Joe Biden was the nominee. We were seeing numbers that essentially were fundamentally incompatible with a Democratic victory. With Harris, those numbers have stabilized a little bit and she's improved, but we still see some noticeable swings. And I'll just share very briefly. We track not just the we have a national polling average. We track all what we consider to be reputable polls. In that, we have an average of Harris up by 1.2 points nationally. Of course, everyone knows we don't elect the president nationally. But it's a good indicator because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 2 points, Biden by about 4.5. So Harris is not matching either of them in our polling aggregator. What we see is we also keep track of the demographic crosstabs, and we average those out as well, which is sort of a unique tool. Though those crosstabs can be kind of noisy if they're not averaged out, but when they are taken in sort of a holistic perspective, they can be helpful in terms of figuring out general trends. Biden won African Americans by about 90-9 margin in 2020, and we have Harris up by somewhere like 79-17. So that's edging on a 20-point swing. I don't think it will be that big in the end. I think a lot of that is noise. I think a lot of that is some voters who just aren't paying a ton of attention. They haven't paid a ton of attention. They won't until the very end here, this home stretch. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Harris's numbers with that group improve. But that's a substantial swing. And if we see anything like that, then it's safe to say Georgia and North Carolina are going to be very, very, very challenging for Harris and probably very good for Trump. The other group that we see a lot of shift with is Latino voters. This is a group Biden won by about 23, and we have Harris up with that group by about 13. So again, another 10-point swing. I don't know that I believe that all of those are going to be as pronounced as it seems, but it's possible. It's what we're seeing if we average out all the data, which is generally the best way to go about doing that. And that explains a large portion of why this race is so close at this juncture.
Why is Harris doing so much worse than Clinton and Biden when it comes to getting non-white voters?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, especially because Harris is the only one of those three who is herself non-white. So yeah, I think the fact of the matter is, uh, I'll say two things. First is cost of living. I think the inflation of the last couple of years really has taken a toll on minority communities in particular. They are generally, statistically, they're lower income on average. They are more likely to be in working class jobs that have been affected by some of the policies on that have happened. And I think I think a lot of them are just living paycheck to paycheck. That's their primary focus. And if the economy was better under Donald Trump, and we literally have the opportunity to compare, a former president's 4-year term with a current vice president's 4-year term, I think it's worth saying that at least for much of this cycle, Donald Trump's campaign messaging wasn't. I don't want to say it wasn't as inflammatory as 2016 because I don't necessarily, or 2020, I don't necessarily know that that's true. But I do think that it was a little bit more measured, a little bit more nuanced. I think there were a lot of people who, there's been, especially among younger minority voters, there has been sort of a vibe shift, is what we would call, in terms of perception of Trump. A lot of them view him now as sort of almost like a gangster figure who's been vilified by mainstream press, and he's obviously got a lot of baggage there. But so I think there is some degree of disparity among age. We see younger minorities in particular being willing to vote for him. I think there's a social element too. I mean, the Democratic Party has largely embraced transgender politics, and that's not necessarily something that we see in polling that's very popular among minority groups, especially non-college educated minority groups. So I think those are two reasons. But I will just add, the rally at Madison Square Garden was not compatible with what I would describe as a campaign that had largely managed to avoid alienating specific communities. It feels like in the home stretch, Trump is leaning very hard into some of the rhetoric that could jeopardize support from Latino voters, whom he really needs to make inroads with based on what we're seeing in his performance with white college-educated voters, and also Arab Americans, who many of whom were going to sit this race out. A lot of them live in Michigan, about 2%, 3% of the state. If many of them decide at the last minute that they're going to come home and they're going to vote Democratic, then we would expect to see a very late shift in the polls in Michigan for Harris, and I wouldn't rule that out.
Could I ask just really quickly, about the narrative that I've seen throughout this election cycle, which is one really questioning the legitimacy of the opinions of elites. And this has manifested itself in so many different ways. But, one of them is that basically, Vice President Harris got the nomination without the grueling process that most have to go through. And as I look at news stories like the kind of backlash against the jokes at the Madison Square Garden event, of course, I abhor the content of the jokes, but I think there's something missing here in the kind of self-awareness of elites talking about this issue, right? Which is that that kind of humor appeals to some people, and they look at it as humor. They're not, there to analyze it as though it were a kind of policy program. And that tension, I think, it kind of demonstrates the anti-establishment feeling. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's wrong, or how do you see this kind of in the end game of the election playing out?
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it also explains some of the change in support that we've seen. I think a lot of people, subscribe to the famous adage of taking Trump. What is it? Taking Trump seriously, but not literally. And I think a lot of people do feel like, especially his base, feel like many of the comments that he made were in jest and were taken excessively seriously by the media, which was doing its very, very best to hold him accountable during the first term that he served, if he potentially the only term that he'll serve. I think there's truth to that. I do also think that when it really feels targeted at a specific subset of the electorate, which I think in the case of that Puerto Rico joke, it was, that causes more trouble. And I think some jokes are more outwardly offensive than others. And I think there isn't much of a punchline to calling Puerto Rico a giant floating pile of garbage. And I think the fact that Republicans on this one are coming out and decrying it pretty forcefully is an indication that it was a major faux pas of this campaign. I mean, it has the potential, combined with some of the other stuff that has been said in the last couple of days, to bring some of those voters, many of whom I imagine were considering voting for Trump in places like Allentown, Pennsylvania, and in Philadelphia in particular, may end up coming home to Democrats. But I do think, yes, in terms of overall general, he'll probably improve with minority groups. I think there is something to be said for the anti-elite. Learn to laugh at the occasional joke about race or gender, and not be so offended by everything. I do think that's having an effect, especially on younger voters.
Why do you think, and this is speculation, that he was able to sort of control his narrative and come across as more nuanced and less bombastic? Why can't the people running his campaign keep him in line for one more week?
Well, I don't know that they were keeping him in line. He was largely staying away from any media that was not extremely friendly to him. He was going on podcast outlets that were generally very, supportive of him, and he calling into Fox News. But he was not doing the typical mainstream press sit downs that he was doing for much of 2016 and 2020, especially when he was the president. He was being interviewed all the time. And, Donald Trump has the tendency to just say things that can, his advisors would probably hope that he would not actually say in the grand scheme of things, but he isn't somebody who can be restrained or controlled that way. And I think a good example of this is we had not seen much of Trump until the debate. And quite frankly, he was unable to control many of the impulses that his advisors were hoping very, adamantly that he was not going to lean into, most specifically on the 2020 election. And he just cannot let that go, despite the fact that it's completely false. And that's a major turnoff to voters. I mean, I know his advisors were telling him, please do not, litigate this. Do not bring it back up. Pivot to what the economy was like on January 6th, which was supposed to be the talking point. And it's the best talking point that they could have had on that issue. It's not a winning issue, but it's the best way to neutralize some of the negative press about it. But he was unable to do that. Talking about migrants eating pets, these are not things that I think a lot of Republicans were particularly excited about in the home stretch. We see this phenomenon in this campaign, which is that, and by the way, we've seen this in 2016 and 2020. Both candidates are generally fairly disliked. And so the one that is in the news the most is typically the one who's doing the worst. They are typically the one. Nobody wants to be in the news, and I do think both campaigns have sort of figured this out. Harris is not exactly making the media tour herself. She's done a little bit more because she has more work to do in terms of winning over skeptical moderate voters. But neither of them are particularly excited about doing interviews with mainstream press, as evidenced by Harris doing the Call Her Daddy podcast and some other Stephen Colbert. So it's I think there is a I think both candidates are trying to stay out of the spotlight, and I think in the last week, Trump's rally was anything but that.
Matthew, I'm a bit concerned about, the belief that Trump is so disliked. I mean, I listened to the whole 3 hours of the Joe Rogan podcast. And I mean, to me, Trump has kind of transcended just being a political candidate and is now a kind of folk hero. And, to those of us who have professional backgrounds or educations at the tertiary level, when someone says things that we take to be factually false, there's this kind of like revulsion that we immediately feel about what that person is saying. But I don't really think that that's true for the vast majority of people who tune into Dude Radio, right? Like they're there to kind of hear the folk story of America. And I don't know. I mean, I really worry that when we try to understand Trump, we miss the fact that, whether or not he's saying, like sort of what would be reported in a newspaper is not the point. But do you think that that's at all true here? I mean, is there an element of that with Harris as well, or?
Yeah, I do think that's true. In fact, I think it's probably more true for Trump. Trump is basically running a base campaign. He is at 47, a little over 47% in our national average. And that is actually the highest that he would have gotten if he gets that share nationally. He got 46.1% in 2016. He got 46.8% in 2020. So he has focused very strongly on his base. And you're right; they do eat that up. There has not been historically a ton of consequences for Trump on telling falsehoods, in large part because he can win the Electoral College with 47%. He would not be president if we had a national popular vote, but that's not the way the game is played, and he knows that, and his advisors know that for the most part. And that explains why he's not really making any concerted effort to sway the middle suburban, some of those old suburban moderates, because that would alienate his base, and he needs his base more than he needs anything else. So I think, I do think that there is an element of this, that the conversation that gets lost because people like us who are used to dealing with stuff on a factual basis and questioning how somebody who doesn't, at times outright lies is so popular. But I think for a lot of people, it's not even about what is being said. It's just about the fact that he's willing to stick it to the man in Washington, D.C. and the elites in New York, that I think, they are willing to consider voting for him, and that is a huge asset for him. It has not been. I think it is time to rethink Trump's lying as an impediment to his success, and maybe even it may even be a benefit. That's not to say it's right or wrong. I don't. As a journalist, I find it wrong, but it's helpful to him. I mean, it hasn't. People don't listen to mainstream press the way that they used to. It's really a struggling industry. Most Americans now get their news from social media, and his team has run a much more coordinated social media strategy this time around. They have many more. It feels like they have many more. Just anecdotally, it feels like they have many more allies on X, obviously with Elon Musk, and on TikTok. than they did in 2020. And absolutely that helps them. The proliferation, I mean, we just see this, diversification of how people get their news, and even the number of conservative outlets that have popped up that aren't Fox News. You really can pick and choose what you read these days, and so it's a shame, in my opinion, that that's the case, because I do think it's important that we stick to one set of facts. But yeah, it
Well, I
is
mean,
it is not.
how do you think people are responding to things like the McDonald's picture? I mean, it's like, oh, whoops. I guess, we don't have to care about this because, she claims she worked at McDonald's, but like, I don't know. I mean, I just, it's just amazing to see the juxtaposition of that story against, the racist joke story, where like, to me, it's just profoundly dishonest to describe a comedian's jokes as like assertions of reality. And
Mhm.
this is like part of what I see as the problem here is that the narrative just unendingly in the surround sound in DC is like Trump really is a bad guy. People who support him are bad people. I don't know. I mean, where's the kind of recognition that we're hearing spin from the other side as well?
Well, I think there's a distinction to be made people who between when the press says that people should feel offended and when people are actually offended and concerned. I mean, that does happen. And Donald Trump is no different than other politicians. They can say offensive things and people can respond to them the way that they feel. I think many times that is overblown. I think Trump, sure, a lot of, his statements, especially among his supporters, and I think even among a large swath of independents, people feel like those are, and the people that he hangs around with in the case of his rally, not entirely serious. But that doesn't mean you have a license to go around and say whatever you want and expect there to be no consequences. And I think the fact that we're hearing some, real internal and external concern from Republicans indicates that there is an awareness among his own group that there is some problem with what was said.
Yeah, I want to shift forward a bit. Let's say we're sitting here in 8 days and Trump won. What would be the synopsis for why he won?
He won because he got his base out to vote, and he made small but noticeable inroads with minority voters. He probably won via the Sun Belt through Arizona, which looks like his best state at this point, by making inroads with Latino Americans there. Probably won Georgia and North Carolina because of support among African Americans. Probably won Nevada if he's doing well enough with Hispanic voters. And there's a decent chance that he wins the Rust Belt states as well. I don't think it's a particularly complicated narrative. I don't think it's a particularly unlikely scenario. I think it's very likely that that's what happens next week. And if that's the case, then I think we're likely to see it taking the path that all the polls seem to indicate it will take.
And if we're sitting here in 8 days and Kamala Harris was elected, why did she win?
If Kamala Harris is elected, she made pretty substantial inroads with white college-educated voters in the suburbs, places like the collar counties of Philadelphia, the Fulton County, Georgia, the northern Atlanta suburbs, Oakland County, Michigan, Kent County, Michigan, places where there are large numbers of white college-educated voters. She probably is going to lose ground with Hispanics no matter what, but maybe she keeps those losses to within single digits and makes up that ground with college-educated voters in Scottsdale, Arizona, and Paradise Valley and other places that where she could potentially offset some of those losses. And she performs similarly with Biden among black voters, which is a possibility. I think she'll probably lose a little bit of ground there. She can probably afford to lose a couple of points, but she would need to sort of hold her own with minority voters, not lose a ton of ground. She would also need to not lose a ton of ground with white non-college educated voters. And this is where I'm the most skeptical of some of the data that we're seeing. Right now, our average has her doing about the same as Joe Biden did with non-college educated white voters, based on how he actually did in 2020 from a well-reputable source that sort of aggregates all the data, and once it was all said and done. This is just anecdotal. I think some of the people in my office feel similarly. I don't know that I believe Harris is going to perform the same with that demographic as Joe Biden did. He had a much more, quite frankly, relatable image. I mean, he was a white guy. He had long been Scranton Joe, Irish Catholic. He still lost the demographic by some 30 points, but is Harris going to make some of those voters in Scranton and Allentown and important parts of the industrial Midwest? Does she have the same level of appeal among that demographic? I'm a little skeptical there. I do think abortion has changed the equation, so I'm not dismissing it as a possibility, especially with women. I could see her making inroads with non-college educated white women. I do think she has a problem with men of pretty much all races, but she would have to perform similarly among that demographic, or just vastly better with college educated white voters. Possible, but it's not a guarantee.
Looking back, do you think Biden would have been the stronger nominee?
No, I think Biden was not. He was unable to make an effective campaign message. We would have seen this race tighten because it's an election in the USA, and that's what happens. But he was down even before the reports of his cognitive. I mean, there were reports of his cognitive decline that many were not taking seriously. But once the debate happened, it became very apparent to people who are not necessarily covering this on a day-to-day basis that the guy is not where he was 4 years ago. And I think, that we saw a switch go off. He dropped several points. I mean, several is in 3, which is as akin to a gargantuan shift as we see these days in the polls. But he was down to Trump by 3 or 4, and if Trump's winning the popular vote by 3 or 4 points, you have no chance. I mean, you have no path. So he would have gotten that up. He would have gotten it up to 2 probably, but you have to be able to go out on the campaign trail vigorously and address your supporters with the compelling message. And Biden just was not able to do that.
Yeah. And looking at, just real quick, what's going to be the most exciting gubernatorial and House races we see next week?
Well, if you had asked me at the beginning of the cycle, I would have told you that North Carolina was going to be the most exciting gubernatorial race, and in a way it has, but not to the degree.
Did something happen in North Carolina?
That's right. I wonder. Not to the degree that we thought it was going to be competitive. So we've moved that to likely Democratic. At one point this cycle, it was in toss-up. This was a great opportunity for the GOP, which has struggled to win North Carolina's governorship. They've won it, I think, only 3 times since 1896. It is a historically Democratic. Voters there tend to split their tickets a little bit more. State level tends to be more Democratic, federal more Republican. I think the most competitive race at this juncture is New Hampshire. That's between Kelly Ayotte, former U.S. Senator, and former Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig. Republicans have a trifecta in New Hampshire, which is sort of, Democrats will privately tell you that's one of the more irritating aspects of state politics these days, is they feel like they should have at least some say in what goes on in a state that Joe Biden won by 8 points. Chris Sununu has been a particularly popular governor up there. He has won re-election by double digits all 3 times he ran for an additional term. Now he's retiring. Kelly Ayotte, who lost a U.S. Senate race in 2016 after winning and serving a term from 2010, she's back. She has very high name recognition. She was a fairly moderate member of the U.S. Senate when she was there, but she did sign on to legislation and voted for legislation that would defund Planned Parenthood, which is a toxic stance in New Hampshire. And Democrats are pounding her on the abortion issue on TV. If this race goes to the Democrats, and I think I'd probably favor Ayotte at this point, but if it does go to Joyce Craig, my expectation is that it will break very late. It had a late primary in September that Craig is just sort of getting her footing about now. And so the focus was always going to come very, very late in this campaign. And they're going to they've skewered her very hard on abortion. And, if that ends up being the deciding issue here, it's going to break late. We're going to see Craig probably win. People will describe it as a minor upset. It's really not. It's New Hampshire. It shouldn't be a surprise to see a Democrat win. But I would probably say that Ayotte is the slight favorite just based on what we've seen. I also think Indiana is worth noting. This is another open race. Mike Braun, U.S. Senator, is the Republican nominee. Democrats have an intriguing nominee in Jennifer McCormick, who is a former Republican. She was elected statewide as a Republican in 2016. She was state superintendent of public instruction, had a number of high-profile feuds with the governor and the legislature. They ended up abolishing that job, so she didn't have a position to run for re-election to in 2020. And now she switched parties. She's a Democrat now, and Democrats got her as their nominee. Abortion is a big talking point there. Indiana has extremely strict laws on abortion, including limited exceptions for rape and incest, which seems to be the sticking point for a lot of independent voters around Indianapolis. We still believe Mike Braun is going to win this race. He will do so by a much narrower margin than a Republican in Indiana should, based on where the state is fundamentally. But he has plenty of baggage. His running mate he did not pick his running mate. The state convention picked his running mate for him, bypassing Braun's choice and Trump's choice. I will note Braun's choice and Trump's choice were the same person, and the state convention of party activists chose Pastor Micah Beckwith, who is to say that he is a lightning rod would be very generous. He is, has a history of making some wild statements. And Braun really has tried to distance himself throughout this campaign from his own running mate, who pledged at the convention that he was going to be a check on Braun, which is something you rarely see in politics. They've had an awkward marriage. It's been very challenging on the campaign trail. Democrats are starting to hit Braun for some of the Beckwith ties that he has now. We think this race will go Republican, but it's worth keeping an eye on.
Awesome. Matthew, I know you're very busy. I don't want to keep you all day, but this was wonderful. Thank you. For our listeners, where can they find your work?
Yeah, cookpolitical.com. I encourage you to check it out. We've got race ratings galore, where you can see where we're thinking for the House, which is also very competitive this cycle. We're going to be out with our final projections later this week for everything. And I do know that I think we will be moving. I don't know that for a fact, but an electoral college rating as well, just for a little final splash on the electoral map. And so I would encourage everyone to consider getting a subscription. It's some of the best political insight you'll get.
Thanks, Matthew. We're big fans over here, so I hope our listeners all head over there soon, especially before the election. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again for listening to Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to share with your friends and tune in next time.